Hello, I'm Suzanne James. Welcome to Nightshift, the podcast where we talk all things voluntary assisted dying in Australia. Today we'll be looking at the recent amendments that went through Victorian Parliament to the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Act. I'm very pleased today to be joined by my very close friend and mentor, President of Dying with Dignity Victoria, Jane Morris. She joins us now from Melbourne. Jane, welcome.
Thank you very, very much, Suzanne, and it's an absolute pleasure to speak with you today.
It's been quite some time since we caught up with you, Jane. You've been quite busy, especially in the last few months. Tell us, if you will, just for the uninitiated, what drove this review, why the legislation was being reviewed in Victorian Parliament now?
Well, as most people know, the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Act was passed in 2017. And at the time when it was passed, it was cited as being the most conservative of its type in the world. It had 68 safeguards. And really, when it came to the bill being passed, it was a case of people agreeing to some safeguards they knew would be problematic, or trying to fight those and then probably not getting the bill passed at all. So the bill was passed with these safeguards, which, as anticipated, did prove quite problematic, and also problems arose that were never envisaged. We got a lot of phone calls to our office, people who tried to start the process and found they faced huge impediments. And tragically, a lot of these people were the very people for whom the law was originally designed to help. So we had people, because of their postcode where they lived in rural areas, may have found that there was a one and only doctor in their town who conscientiously objected to voluntary assisted dying. Perhaps the local hospital there was faith-based. We decided, as with a lot of other stakeholders, that to enable this legislation to work most efficiently, amendments had to be made.
Just talk us through, if you will, what kind of negotiations and review process goes into something like this? What was happening behind the scenes before the recent vote that we saw when those amendments were passed?
Well, a lot of work. As you know, we had a 5-year review on the first 4 years of voluntary assisted dying in Victoria. And when this review was handed down, the government announced that they accepted the 5 recommendations in the report. Now, this report was meant to be purely operative. However, the government at the same time listed a list of amendments, legislative amendments that they proposed. And that was because they had so much feedback that people were being really compromised and discriminated. So we were very, very grateful to have been considered a key stakeholder. And there were, along with other stakeholders, we met with the government regularly. We did a lot of work visiting MPs, because since 2017, we'd found a lot of the MPs who were there for the original debate had left Parliament. So many weren't even well versed on what voluntary assisted dying actually was. We met with other organisations. We actually had an event at Parliament House where we had over 20 organisations represented, lots of individuals who'd either been through the process with a loved one, to people who were writing books. We had doctors who were VAD providers, nurse practitioners. It was absolutely fantastic, and we really could see there is this wonderful, there was a need, and there is a great future for a VAD community where we can all work together now in the future, and it probably the onus won't be just on a few organisations.
What were the amendments that were passed? And give us a brief overview of why those particular amendments were each so important.
There were 13 amendments initially listed by the government. I suppose the first amendment we always think of is the gag clause. Now, this was the clause where a doctor was not allowed to bring up the option of voluntary assisted dying for his patient. So the patient could be eligible for all the voluntary assisted dying criteria, but the doctor could not tell the person about this. Now, this was highly discriminatory because there were people who would go and see their doctors in incredible amount of pain, dying, leave the doctor's surgery, go home, die a horrific death, and it wouldn't be till later the family would find out that VAD was an option. So this has been changed now, and doctors, nurse practitioners, nurses who have been registered for 5 years, registered psychologists, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander medical practitioners are now allowed to provide and initiate that option when they see patients. Originally, the government had said any registered practitioner who was a member of APRA would be able to provide this advice. Now, a lot of MPs found this very confronting because they didn't like the idea of your chiropractor, your dentist, anyone like that who perhaps wasn't directly involved in your care, bringing up the topic. So the government did then amend their amendment and decided upon the aforementioned medical practitioners who were actually directly involved in someone's care.
That brings me to my next question, which was in relation to the 6 to 12 month timeframe safeguard. Tell us what's changed there, Jane.
Well, in the original Act, a doctor had to say that you had only 6 months to live to qualify for VAD unless you had a neurodegenerative illness such as motor neuron disease. This has now been changed to 12 months for all conditions. Canberra, the ACT, has introduced their legislation 2 weeks ago, and they don't have any time frame.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we were really, really thrilled to see was the conscientious objection issue. Now, doctors were able to conscientiously object. In Victoria, with the voluntary assisted dying legislation, a doctor had no legal requirement to provide any information or give you any direction as where to seek help. You would ask, and the doctor would say, as we've heard in many cases, I don't believe in that, or that's for wimps. Now, it is required, the doctors are required to provide a minimal amount of information. And when I say minimal information, it might just simply be a bit of paper with the name of the Victorian Volunteer Assisted Dying Care Navigator Service, just so someone has got a reliable source of information to seek. It was quite interesting during the debate to hear a lot of discussion around this issue. And what I found most interesting was a lot of people talked about, people's rights, but a lot of people centred on the rights of the doctor to conscientiously object. And not many people seem to centre on the rights of the patient.
Yep.
To be informed. So it was quite an interesting debate, but thank goodness now doctors will be required to provide that minimum bit of information.
So what's next, Jane, after conscientious objection? What's your next most favourite amendment?
Well, I think you referred to the residency requirement, and the original Act required someone to be Australian citizen or permanent resident. Now, tragically, there were a couple of cases of people who applied for VAD, did everything right, ticked every box, and may have lived in Australia for decades, but unfortunately hadn't taken out Australian citizenship. And there were quite a few people. This was especially problematic with people from New Zealand, and it was just cruel to see. So now the legislation's been changed that someone can only live in Australia for 3 years is the requirement. The other one was being an ordinary citizen of Victoria. We found there was still a lot of problems with that, someone having to have lived there for 12 months, because as you can imagine on the borders, for example, Albury, Wodonga, people might live in Victoria and yet get their medical treatment over in
Or
New
they might
South
need to. They might need to
Wales.
go to family while they're unwell as well in order to be cared
Absolutely.
for. Yeah.
So there are sort of quite a few reasons why people would do that. So there is the availability now for someone to apply for a compassionate exemption, which is absolutely fantastic, and that is a really great idea. The next one is the doctor training requirement. At the moment, one of the doctors must be a specialist for at least 5 years. Specialist GP or a specialist.
Right.
There were one or two members who seem to not quite understand this, because the amendment they're trying to make is to lower that experience of a specialist from 5 years down to 1 year. Now, there was one MP who seemed to understand that it was a person having one experience post-medicine. So you get someone who finished medicine and then could go out and do VAD. But that's not the case at all, because we know that to do a medical degree can take between 4 and 6 years. There's then 1 year of internship. And then to become a specialist, some of those courses take 4 to 6 years. So we can see people studying for 12, 14 years before they become a specialist. And then now, with the amendment, they'll only have to do 1 year out before then they can become VAD qualified. So that, hopefully, it seems minor, but hopefully that will just increase the number of doctors who are able to become VAD providers. The other amendment that I haven't discussed yet that has been included is allowing nurse practitioners or registered nurses who have been registered for 5 years to help or take on the role of the administrating practitioner, which means that the nurses or the nurse practitioners are able to administer the VAD substance without the doctor having to be there. And once again, in rural areas, this will prove a huge, huge help and decrease the workload for the doctors.
They need to be RNs at least, wouldn't they?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they've got to be 5 years, five
Yep.
years of being a registered nurse.
Okay, is there any other amendments you want to bring to light?
Another very, very important one is in Victoria, the default position right from the get-go has been for the patient to self-administer the substance. Now, when they get this substance and the due day comes that they've decided they'd like to ingest it, some have found that they're unable to swallow. And that has been heartbreaking. We've got one horrific story of a young girl who was unable to ingest her substance on that morning and rang the doctor and said, could we have a doctor here so that the substance can be administered intravenously? This required a separate permit, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. It took a couple of weeks.
Poor girl.
So this poor girl and her mother had to watch her suffering, and it was just indescribable. Anyway, now the patient has the choice of either self-administered or physician-administered. If they decide to have the substance physician self-administered and decide at the last minute to change, that can all be done without going through all the paperwork and seeking a permit, which is fantastic.
So the default is now either or.
Yes.
Are there any amendments that you wanted, that you were negotiating, that you felt were important that you didn't get?
But as you said, we've seen the ACT get rid of this time frame, and what it does allow is more emphasis on the actual suffering of a person. Someone who's got 4 years to live may be suffering just as much, even more, than someone who gets this prognostic time frame of 6 or 12 months, which it is now.
It was also supposed to be about the patient and the patient suffering and the point at which the patient felt that they couldn't live with it anymore and that they wanted to avail themselves of this as an illegal end of life option. It's disappointing in some ways that it still comes down to what the doctor thinks, but it certainly is a lot improved to what it was with those changes to the legislation, which makes me want to ask you, what does happen to people who go through this very onerous approval process and are desperately ill and just want to have the option of VAD, who are, for whatever reason, rejected? How do they deal with that? Is there a service that assists them?
Generally, no, there is nothing to help them. And what is even more tragic is in November last year, one of the Victorian coroner released a report of 8 suicides in Victoria, and 8 of those 8 people were found to have been deemed ineligible for voluntary assisted dying. There was also a 9th case, which they thought this was also applicable, but we're waiting to have that confirmed. And I think what a lot of people really need to be reminded is that we have all these problems, or we've had all these problems with our legislation, but in the background is the telehealth issue.
Yes,
And
that still has not been resolved.
that hasn't been resolved. And that is just probably one of the cruelest things of all for people in rural areas, even people living in the city who are in so much pain. They cannot get out of bed to visit a doctor face to face. And I think that will, if we can get that resolved, that will make a huge difference. Another problem, actually, when I'm just thinking that was heavily debated during the amendments, is the interpreter requirement.
Oh, that's awkward. Yeah.
Now, that was very, very hard because obviously the telehealth issue applies to an interpreter as well. So if someone lives in rural Victoria miles away
Got to
and
be
they're
on
having
site.
they have to be on site. And there are some languages for which they don't have the properly accredited interpreters. So what they've brought in as an amendment is that if an accredited interpreter cannot be found, they can try and make a special exemption to the Secretary of the Health Department for a community member to act as an interpreter, not a family member, but as an interpreter. And I think this is the case in New South Wales. And it hasn't been problematic. And I would say the number of cases would be minimal where this would happen, but it would be cruel to see someone not able to access VAD because an interpreter wasn't available.
All right. So what's next for the Board of Dying with Dignity Victoria? You've had so much on your plate lately, so many wonderful things happening. Now you've got these amendments through. You've got the Young Ambassadors program. We saw them recently at the World Federation of Right to Die Society on the webinar with Danielle, and that was just so fabulous to see. Jane, aren't they just a great bunch of beautiful young people?
They just continue to take my breath away. I just love them. And the ideas they're still coming out with. When we started the program, I wanted it all to sort of happen overnight. It's been happening slowly, but we're getting interest from all over the world. And as I said, they just are so wonderful. I actually went to a play the other night with quite a few of them. The play is called Dying, a Memoir, and it was by Susan Corey, an Australian woman. I think she wrote it in 2019, and it was she was dying and talked about how she wanted voluntary assisted dying. It was a brilliant play, but it was just so wonderful to attend, me as an old woman going with these young ambassadors and just
Steady on.
talking about it. Oh no, it was really, really, I'm just in awe of them. And it's just great for us to know that this next generation, the law and the legislation are going to be in safe hands. And I think the great thing of having included them in all this work is they have respect for the legislation, and they've also got respect for the parliamentary system and seeing that things don't happen overnight. You've got to really, really work for it.
And then, of course, there's the wonderful Danielle with the canine program. I understand she attended your parliamentary forum back in September. How did that go?
Oh, it went so well. We did have one, Daniel probably told you, we did have one episode where one of the MPs was lying down in the hallway patting the dog, and the Speaker of the House thought there was a medical emergency and came down. Luckily, we didn't have the paramedics running down as well, but oh no, it went really well. And we are finding that people who want us to go and do presentations are now saying, oh, and can we get the dog along too, please? Which
No.
is absolutely fantastic.
And one of your ex-board members, Dr. Cam, has also just been awarded the Rodney Syme Medal for 2025. Tell us about that, Jane.
Yes, well, the Rodney Syme Medal is given to someone who has really sort of led the field with voluntary assisted dying. And Cam was one of the, in the first year, he was one of the doctors that probably did the most assisted dying procedures. And everyone who's had anything to do with him just absolutely loves him. He goes above and beyond. And the stories from our September the 11th event of people whom Cam had helped, just amazing. He's been wonderful. And even though he's not on the board, he's someone I can ring for advice, and he always, without a doubt, rings back in a few minutes and very, very, very keen to help. A bit like Nick Carr, we are just so, and Adam Steinberg on our board, we are so lucky to have these doctors that are just so willing to help and just so kind and compassionate.
So what's next for you and for the Board of Dying with Dignity Victoria, Jane?
Well, I would say a really good rest and holiday.
A couple of champers?
A couple of those. In January we will have a strategy day, which will be really good, and just really work out where to from now. Hopefully we'll be involved in the implementation process and meet with other stakeholders and the government to discuss how that will all unfurl. But we're very, very happy to work with the government alongside that. Of course, Suzanne, I'd also like to say that we are very, very honoured and felt very privileged to have been considered key stakeholders with the state government. And we really appreciated the amount of time that they spent meeting with us and also just respecting our ideas. It was wonderful, and we really hope we can keep this relationship up because I think it's very, very important. And we're really keen after our September the 11th event to really create and keep this BAD community together and to perhaps meet a lot more.
And of course, we can't go any further without acknowledging the extraordinary contribution of MP Emma Voolen, who, of course, is herself suffering from motor neurone disease. How is she going, Jane? I know she's becoming unwell and not contesting the next election and obviously wants to spend more time with her family. How is she after such a monumental effort, being so unwell and pushing so hard for these changes?
I get very emotional because I just love Emma. I've got to know her very well.
Yeah.
And she's probably one of the most stoic, brave, inspirational. I know they're words we use a lot, but I don't know any other words in the dictionary
Yeah.
I can use. Kind people ever. Her dedication and loyalty to her constituents is amazing. Even this morning, a weekend, a Saturday, I've seen she's out at functions with her constituents. And at the same time, she's a mother. She's got two teenage children. Emma is just wonderful, and she has done so much for the MND cause. But this is what she wants to do, and this is how she wants to live the rest of her life. And as I said, I've just got nothing but absolute admiration for dear, beautiful Emma.
I've always said that the true heroes of VAD are those that fight for reform, knowing that they may well not live long enough to see it. And I'd also like to acknowledge the passing of my friend Jan Willis, who was on one of my podcasts a while back. She passed away on September 11 when you were having your parliamentary forum, and she also had motor neurone disease and had been approved for VAD in New South Wales. She had, at the time of her death, gone to the hospice, where they had fortunately been very compassionate, knew her quite well because she had been a palliative care nurse herself. and she'd arranged to pass away with VAD there, but unfortunately, as so often happens, became sick and unconscious and put on morphine before she had a chance to do that, but fortunately passed away quite quickly. And I'd also like to acknowledge Steve-O from the Northern Territory, who recently passed away. He was in a hospice and quite alone, except for a good fishing mate of his, and he was unable to get VAD, and he was all over the government and the radio and the television and newspapers and pay tribute to Steve-O. He knew he wasn't going to live very long, but he took every opportunity he had to champion the cause. So rest in peace, Steve-O, mate. You're a legend.
And I think what you just said before, Suzanne, is so true. The real heroes of this are the people who campaigned selflessly, tirelessly, right up to the moment of death, knowing that they weren't going to benefit from voluntary assisted dying.
So thank you very much for joining us today, Jane.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Suzanne. It always is.
You've been listening to Jane Morris, is President of Dying with Dignity Victoria. They, along with other advocacy organisations and many, many supporters and community leaders, have been successful in getting a raft of changes through on the recent statutory review of the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Act. I'm Suzanne James. Thank you for joining us on Nightshift.